UST. How long have we been talking about this, Lawrence? That, algorithmic stablecoins are not inherently so stable. And so we're seeing that now when a major market event is happening right now. And of course, UST lost its peg. And Luna Foundation Guard is now lending $1.5 billion in Bitcoin and Terra USD to defend the peg of its algorithmic stablecoin to the US dollar. Over the weekend, UST briefly lost its peg to the US dollar, falling to about 98 cents before climbing back to almost $1. At the same time, Luna dropped around 10%. Joining us now to discuss is Cory Klippsten, CEO of Swan Bitcoin. Good morning, Cory. So I guess we wanted to walk back and maybe you could walk us through the mechanics of how did UST lose its peg?
Yeah, it's a confidence game. Literally the old school definition of a confidence game, right? Which I'm sure we know what the short version of that is. But people are seeing the value of Luna, the altcoin that essentially provides the pegging mechanism where they trade in and out of Luna algorithmically with UST. And this was looking a little bit better when Luna was in the 40 billions of market cap, but now, as of this morning, it's almost on par with the UST. So I think UST is 19 billion and Luna is 20 billion. So that makes people really, really nervous. And so, they foresaw that this might happen at some point and started making noise in the Bitcoin space about setting up what they called Luna Foundation Guard. And so this is this group of Do Kwon and 3 or 4 other insiders that control the keys for a few $1 billion. And they've been buying Bitcoin with it ostensibly to shore up UST, their pretend stablecoin, because again, as you note, not so stable.
So they saw this coming, and by design, they're supposed to mint Luna to stabilize the peg, but now they're not doing that. So does their initial model just not work?
Their initial model doesn't work because it causes a death spiral, which is basically there's nothing different without this Luna Foundation Guard thing and the buying of the Bitcoin and the reserves, and frankly, with their insider relationships of market makers and large trading firms that will essentially take payment in, essentially it's the value created by pumping Luna over the last year or so, is where they're taking their payment to create these markets and try to hold the peg. So you've got Jump and 3 Arrows Capital and a few of those guys who make all the trading fees on the arbitrage of holding the peg in the first place. They just want to kind of keep that thing going. It's kind of the same mechanism when you hear sometimes that big firms have sold a lot of covered calls, even on Bitcoin, and they have the incentive to keep that going because they're clipping that coupon for themselves and their clients for a long period of time. They actually have the incentive to lose a little bit of money going leverage short anytime Bitcoin starts to get close to the strike price of the covered calls that they've sold. So you kind of see that coiling. It's kind of a similar thing, like some of these market makers and trading firms that make a lot of money maintaining that peg. Up to some point, there's an amount of money that they will lose to keep that game going. But at some point, they're capitalists, they're mercenary, they have their risk models. And at some point, it just breaks. It may break this week. It may break later today. It may break in a few months. It may break next year. But the bigger this thing gets, the worse it's going to be for everybody involved.
I certainly want to get into that, into what the after effects could be. But if we step back, as you mentioned, that it's a small group of people making the decision to take the Bitcoin, buy the Bitcoin, and essentially prop up their Luna. So a couple of things. First of all, where did they get the money to prop up Luna with Bitcoin? Is it from essentially printing more Luna and using that? I mean, where does it come from that it could be used in loan to the reserves? And remember, it's a loan, you said, so it'll eventually have to come back. But where did they get where did that source come from? And is it essentially essentially a version of, just taking some of the things that they would have minted and put it into Bitcoin and then out? How did that whole structure happen?
Yeah, so the Luna management team, the centralized team that controls Luna and UST, so I guess Terra is the company, they printed a ton of Luna and they only floated some of it, and they kept, I don't know what the number is, but something like half of it, maybe even more than half, it might be 60% or more of the Luna essentially on their balance sheet of their company. And so that's what they sold into the markets, essentially, creating that money out of thin air to be able to buy Bitcoin with it. And that's okay as long as there's plenty of demand for Luna, but there's not much demand for Luna anymore because people don't believe in their ability to maintain the peg anymore. And the only reason that Luna exists in the first place is based on people's confidence in the peg for UST.
We had Do Kwon on here a few months ago in a rather contentious interview. And he
was a little triggered.
He was a lot triggered, which is understandable because his business model. But one of the questions we asked him was, what makes you any different than Iron Titan, that whole collapse? And he said, well, the economics of Luna are much different than what you saw with Titan and Iron back a few months ago, which famously imploded. Is that really the case, or is that just sort of something that, he's just making up?
Yeah, I mean, the mechanism is basically exactly the same as the other ones. It was clever to set up the Luna Foundation Guard, which wasn't something that was part of their plans initially. It's something that they did essentially as a stopgap earlier this year because they foresaw that this would happen, and they figured that could stave things off a little bit longer. I mean, the whole game here is how much of the printed out of thin air Luna coin that Do Kwon and his VC insiders and trading partners, basically the big OTC desks, came up with, and they granted themselves all this token. And the shell game, and this is what's behind the 20% that they pay out on Anchor Protocol, is really because that mechanism works because they're paying to pump up the price of Luna while they exit their position. So the longer they can keep this thing going, the more Luna they can sell. That's real Bitcoin that they bought. If they can get out of this holding billions of dollars of Bitcoin at the end of the day, if they can, just continue to sell Luna into the open market and buy real estate in Manhattan, Long Island, or whatever it is they do with their money, like the longer they can keep this thing going, the more money they make. So there's a lot of incentives for the OTC desks and the Luna team to kind of work together to keep the game going.
I wanted to bring up a tweet from the Luna Foundation Guard. They said that essentially traders will trade the capital on both sides of the market, eventually maintaining parity of the LFG, Luna Foundation Guard reserve pool, denominated in BTC as market conditions progressively stabilize. And just for fun, there's a tweet from Chimpzu tweeting, did Luna really buy BTC at 47,000 just to sell it at 34,000 to defend the peg? Now, they're not selling, they're loaning. But, and Do Kwon has clarified that the Bitcoin will be used to trade, but the stronger intent is to signal peg strength in the market as capitulation sentiment has set in. He says that the LFG is long Bitcoin. But again, aren't they supposed to mint Luna? And is this now then a BTC-backed stablecoin strategy? And what happens if BTC continues to go down?
Yeah, well, I think I'm blanking on the GP's name at Galoy Capital, but I think you've had him on as well at some point. I'm going to say maybe it's Keith. But anyway, he had a nice tweet about 2 hours ago, and he said, well, first, fitting that their trading partners get the last scraps of meat off the dying carcass that is Luna. But more importantly, lastly, there's another part that isn't said out loud. They would rather use BTC Treasury to stabilize than the natural UST to Luna conversion, which is obviously how they set it up. This is because they know if the Luna price keeps falling, the whole shell game falls apart. So they'd rather use that Bitcoin that they bought with their printed Luna token and sell that Bitcoin through their market maker into UST to defend the peg, because if they are using the actual mechanism the way it's set up in the protocol, you're supposed to print Luna. And again, as you noted, that's the exact same dynamic that was there with Iron and Titan. Then they know that they're heading into a death spiral.
So how does it end up happening? I mean, Mike Novogratz, he has his Luna tattoo on his shoulder. I mean, so what point does he get rid of that? Does he laser that out? I mean, how does it look like, and what happens to Bitcoin?
Well, again, this is a small amount of Bitcoin that they own, and there's plenty of people with larger size that could crash the markets at any time. I mean, there's players that have dumped more Bitcoin than what the Luna Foundation Guard holds in total just in the past few days. So I'm not worried about Bitcoin, and certainly not in the long run with Bitcoin. I think it's going way, way up in the long run. I think this is more just, check yourself before you get on board with supposedly bullish narratives. I think it's really important to have a critical eye and not cheerlead things just because somebody says they like Bitcoin and the narrative seems mildly bullish. I think this is probably the worst false narrative that we've seen in the Bitcoin space since the fake S2F models, which are obviously really embarrassing for Bitcoiners to try to be pushing to anybody that understood stats and math and finance. We kind of got laughed out of the room with the S2F models. And I think something like this is, equally just getting egg on the face of Bitcoiners that have been cheering on a total Ponzi scheme and a scammer.